Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Melvin. One advantage of having meetings on Zoom is that the queue for the bar is much shorter. Many of you will be aware that at the end of last year, Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust celebrated its 75th anniversary. In 1948, when Ted Smith established the trust, Lincolnshire was changing very quickly. Many of our traditional grasslands were being ploughed up, our heathlands being afforested in an effort to produce fast-growing timber. There was pressure on the Lincolnshire coast from holiday establishments. So many of our trust nature reserves now are last fragments of once extensive habitats or species, which were much more extensive in the county. Increasingly, our trust nature reserves, though, are also looked upon for other reasons, things which we often refer to as ecosystem services. Things like water storage, water cleaning, and the big one at the moment, carbon sequestration. So that brings me onto this site, which many of you will have heard of. Some of you may even have visited. This is Crowell Waste, or Crowell Moor, right up in the northwest of the county. It's a fragment of the once extensive complex of bog, mire and fen, which once covered these low-lying flatlands that we know as the Humberhead levels. This area would once have extended much further up to the River Humber, down into the Isle of Axholme and over to Hatfield Chase. This is a heavily designated site. It's a site of special scientific interest, a special protection area, a special area of conservation, and also a Ramsar wetland of international importance. So you would be forgiven for thinking that this was a pristine wilderness. But man's hand has been at work here for many decades, centuries, or even thousands of years. In fact, in the wider National Nature Reserve, evidence of Neolithic and Bronze Age trackways has been found. This also shows the archaeological interest of the site, as well as its biodiversity. But in the years that preceded these, followed these trackways being built, the climate became wetter, and so vegetation built up. And in anaerobic conditions under waterlogging, vegetation would lay down and peat formed. The inhabitants of the Isle of Axholme would probably have largely lived with this water, exploiting areas for fishing, hunting, gathering, and also possibly some minor peat digging, having their settlements on the higher ground. In 1626, then this chap came along, which many of you will possibly have heard of. This is Cornelius Vermuyden, a Dutch engineer. And in 1826, he entered into an agreement with then King Charles I and began a campaign of drainage on the area, diverting some of the major watercourses and bringing about drainage of the land and also enabling the practice of warping, which would involve improving land for agriculture by putting silts on top of the peat deposits. So this is the point really that the landscape in the area really starts to change. From Vermuyden's work, a lot of the local people were granted the right of turbary to cook peat turfs for domestic stoves, and increasingly into the 19th century, small industries built up around peat extraction. Particularly in the late 19th century, a lot of the produce was used as animal litter for bedding things like horses in some of our major settlements. Increasingly, these industries grew and the land started to really change. As we come into the 20th century, things like diesel engines meant that exploitation was even more vast. You can see down the bottom of the screen there some of the very large drainage machinery which began to be employed. And the top of the screen there, this is a process called peat milling, which was brought in from the Dutch in the 1980s. And essentially this turned the landscape into a vast desert. Fortunately, Moor escaped much of this action. But Moor and the greater Humberhead peatlands has long been known for its biodiversity value. There's reference in some of the collections, museums and journals from people like Woodruff Peacock and the Reverend Orpen Morris. But this chap particularly had a huge impact on the site. This is the local naturalist and rebel William Bunting, who waged a campaign of war on some of the peat extractors, and in some ways was influential in Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust's involvement in the site. That said, it's relatively recently that Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust became involved at Crowell. You can just see in the background of this photograph the previously coal-fired power station at Drax. And the trust became involved with Crowell in 1969 when the General Electricity Board proposed to dump 32 million tonnes of slag ash on the site. The trust was quickly able to assemble a team of people from the local museums, also William Bunting and Peter Robinson on behalf of the trust, and David Robinson, sorry, on behalf of the trust, and sent out a team to look at the site. They were able to petition the NCC and also to open a dialogue with Fisons in order to designate part of the site a nature reserve under a management agreement. In 1987, the trust was able to follow up on this by purchasing a large part of the site freehold. So you would think after decades and decades of exploitation and heavy work that there wouldn't be a lot left of Crowell. However, this site is still incredibly biodiverse and holds a number of rare and restricted species. We could spend a huge amount of time going through them all, but I've just displayed a few of the real enigmatic ones here. We have some nice reptiles, including adders on the site, a nationally important population of breeding nightjars. The Humberhead Levels is quite a stronghold for the scarce vapour moth. And then down at the bottom here, some of our real specialities in Lincolnshire, the large heath butterfly, bog rosemary and bog cranberry there. And this is one of the few, if not the only site in Lincolnshire where some of these species still exist. If you want to really look much harder and get down on your knees on site and crawl about, these are some of the real specialities. This is the thorn pinpal and the mire pearl beetle. And these specialities are found only on the Humberhead peatlands in Britain. So that gives you an idea of the rarity. The Thorn and Hatfield Moors Conservation Forum, which is an organisation involved with scientific input into these sites, suggests that the Humberhead peatlands holds around 5,500 species of invertebrate. That's round about a quarter of the whole British fauna. And then the peat. The site is not only important for its biodiversity, but the fact that all the peat hasn't actually been extracted. This is a transect that Lincoln University did for us in about 2022-21, just showing some of the peat depths across the site. If we place a very arbitrary figure on this, there's somewhere between 2 and 3 meters of peat. So that's roughly about 2,000 to 3,000 years of deposited carbon. So what have we been doing on the site? Well, as a lot of my colleagues have mentioned this evening, our volunteers have been hard at work with all sorts of projects. Since we took on the site, the volunteers have really worked hard to enable public access to these sites, putting in access, signage, taking guided walks with the public, and leading educational groups like this group from Lincoln University. They also do a huge amount of work for us behind the scenes on recording. So recording some of these rare invertebrates, and also, very importantly, monitoring the water levels on site to inform our management. Bits and pieces of habitat work. So on the left here, we have an example of an invasive rhododendron, which very quickly spreads. But the real key to our work on site has always been to try and restore the water level, to re-wet this peat. In the past, this would be done by building woody dams. Effectively, what we're trying to do is block up all the vast drainage system that's been put in over the years for the extraction of peat. This is an example of a work programme from 1992 and 93. And the map on the left just gives you an idea of the complexity of these drainage systems. And the map on the right was the proposed actions to put the dams in on the site and raise the water table. An example there of one of our dams. This is quite a nice one, as it shows the original wooden dam, which was probably put in 20 or 30 years ago, which has now been followed with a plastic dam. Process is fairly straightforward. We'll identify where we're losing water from the site, and then we'll try and back it up into the areas where it's needed. In recent years, we've managed to go a little bit more extreme with some of our projects. This is one of the strips which you can see holds a huge head of water, and that, not last summer, but the one before, when we had a really dry spell. You can imagine if we'd let that water go, how much would have been coming off site. Also has a huge importance in terms of fire risk. Not only is keeping the site wet important in terms of biodiversity and carbon capture, but also for risks like fire. This is another project which recently we've been undertaking to try and hold more and more water on site. This is a machine undertaking some peat bunding, which is essentially building a small bank on the surface to reduce the runoff of water into these ditches we've previously talked about. And that's a follow-up image there. So it's basically giving the time for the water to infiltrate into the peat surface rather than running off into this network of drains. Another aspect of our work on site is tree removal. As a conservation charity, when we talk about removing trees, it can often get emotions running quite high. A lot of the habitats that we look after as an organisation are rare and restricted open habitats, and managing the trees is a really important part of our work for various reasons, whether that's restoring open heathland, species-rich grassland, or just routine management in our ancient woodlands. In this particular example, tree removal is important to reduce water losses from the bog and allow re-wetting to occur. Removing the trees reduces the evapotranspiration from the peat surface. You can imagine each one of these root systems acting like a little pump, drawing water out of the peat surface. Prior to the huge drainage of the area for the peat harvesting and exploitation, this area was probably too wet for much of this woodland to establish. This is an example of one of the cells that we've managed to raise the water table and re-wet. There's about 4 years between these photographs, but you can see as the water table starts to raise that the birch trees start to naturally suffer and die back. also creates some wonderful habitat in terms of dead standing wood. And this is a more recent photograph of the same cell, where we've got poor fens starting to develop. And again, another example here of an area that we've managed to re-wet fairly successfully. You can see here the standing deadwood of the birch, and in another season, the proliferation of Eriophorum, the cotton grasses in this photograph. And in this image, you can see this cell where the sphagnum, the bog mosses, so some of the species that are really important in the formation of a bog, starting to take hold. The keen-eyed ones of you will also be able to notice a few reddish spots in the foreground. So this is the round-leaved sundew. Just as an extra little piece of excitement. On another part of the National Nature Reserve in the last couple of years, this species was rediscovered. So this is the sundew plume moth and has been relocated for the first time in over 100 years. So it just shows if we get the habitat right, those little pockets that we believe were probably largely destroyed by the exploitation, these species are probably hanging on. It's important sometimes to admit that we don't always get it perfect, though. This is one of our previous visitor routes where the volunteers have been working hard, and we've got a little bit excited and very successful with our re-wetting. But increasingly, we're also able to benefit from new technologies. So we're able to use remote water monitoring now to see where water's coming off-site and how it's reacting to rainfall events. Got more and more accurate topographic maps, so we can look at the levels in much more detail to inform our work. If we look down on the site, though, you'll notice that the edges are very, very straight. Our northern boundary here and the eastern boundary here. Wildlife and water doesn't conform to straight edges. So increasingly, we're starting to look outwards with our work, as well as the work that we're doing on our core site. You'll also notice that these white areas, if we overlay our land ownership, which is the red, that there's several missing pieces to the jigsaw. This one particularly is giving us a little bit of trouble. You can see the huge peat cliff here where we're losing lots and lots of water from the peat. And when the peat dries out, it oxidizes and is losing carbon to the atmosphere, as well as obviously drying out the important wetland habitat. So in this instance, we've gone for a fairly ambitious project, building a 600-metre hydrological barrier to keep water in this peat body. This was the week that the barrier was installed. And the following week, and after the very wet spell that we've just had, we typically get about 350 mil of rainfall at Crawle every year. And the bog is entirely rain-fed, so it's imperative that we hold on to every bit of water that we can, especially for dry summers like we had in 2022. Again, looking at our margins, these very straight edges, you'll notice that the nature reserve changes very quickly into quite intensive arable farmland. A lot of this land is quite low-lying. And in many cases, we're trying to do two very different things on each side of a straight boundary. We're trying to hold water for the benefit of climate carbon capture for the habitat, whereas farmers are trying very hard, understandably, to grow crops to feed the nation. And some of my colleagues are working very hard on projects to work with these farmers on how we can work more together into the future. There's some quite innovative projects at the moment around the country and on the continent, looking at how we can produce food, but under wetter conditions, and thus try and store more carbon, use the water that we've got to produce either products or food. So these are a few examples of either paludiculture or wet farming, by which we can produce food and products that we need, whether that's for biomass, at the same time as capturing carbon and benefiting wildlife. And this is another interesting thing that's proposed at the moment around the edge of the National Nature Reserve, which is a few large solar farms. This is still in the very early stages at the moment, but at some point we will need to accept that we do need to produce energy or to store energy for the needs of the population. But that doesn't necessarily have to be to the detriment of wildlife. It's important for everybody to work together on these projects. So that's probably something to watch in the near future. I'll just finish by saying that I've largely spoken about Crowle and the Humberhead peatlands this evening, but we do have a number of other peatland sites in the northwest, sites at Epworth and Haxey Turberries on the Isle of Axholme, for example. I also have colleagues at the other end of the county working very hard in the Lincolnshire Fens on the fenland peats. So that's just a very, very whistle-stop tour of some of the history and the work that we've been doing on Crowle Moor, which will continue to be very important into the future. Important just to sit back at this point and think, we've done a huge amount of beneficial work on this site. We've probably been working on this site for around about the last 50 years, but the site's taken probably 3,000 or 4,000 years to form. So it's going to take a much, much longer period of time for us to restore it right into the future. Thank you very much.